Welcome back, everyone. Maya Angelou, the great late poet, in her poem, Our Grandmothers, said, "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000." I think the panelists and myself would concur that when you see us, we're not here on our own volition. We're here because of the sacrifices that have been paid. Over hundreds of years with slavery, being the ancestor, my ancestry going back into slavery, we're here because of the platform that others have laid for us. So I'd like to introduce this session, and it's designed to be in tandem with the afternoon's visit to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a museum that reflects the pain, the struggle, but the resilience and the triumph of African Americans around the world. Because of our Christian faith and our commitment to learning, our conference strives to bring forward conversations that would not ordinarily occur in our everyday lives, but have the benefit of teaching or pressing us into areas of brave conversations. In the human story, context matters. Then and now, the sins of slavery and of racism linger in America. As Christian thought leaders, truth and understanding about this stain on our past and our present will make us better at our God-given assignments. This is why we will now take some time to explore the 400th anniversary of the Transatlantic slave trade with our dear friend, Bishop Claude Alexander, a CCCU board member and pastor of the Park Church in North Carolina, who has put together an extraordinary panel of distinguished scholars and thought leaders. Please join me as we welcome Bishop Alexander and our great panelists.
Well, thank you and good morning to everyone. It is a delight to be here, and I want to thank President Hoekstra for a conversation we had last year when I made her aware of what August 25th, 2019 would mean to our nation, and of why we as an association and why you as leaders of colleges and universities might want to lean in to this reality. It is startling when you consider on August 25th, 1619, 1 year before the arrival of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, 113 years before the birth of George Washington, and 157 years before the formation of our nation, 20 Africans from the kingdom of Ndogo, located in what is now Angola, were brought in chains on a slave ship called the White Lion. And they landed at a point called Point Comfort, which is Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. And they were sold for food. And they were the first enslaved Africans captured and brought to English North America. And thus began the transatlantic slave trade in the English colonies, which would later become the United States of America. It is sobering to think how long the matter of race, racialization, and racism have been alive in this land. When you think of the fact that it was 113 years before the birth of George Washington, it causes you to realize that the matter of race, racialization, and racism was the amniotic fluid into which our founders were born, and therefore helps us explain the tension, the dissonance in how those who spoke of freedom could hold others in bondage, how those who would write the documents that we continue to hold up as the example for the world could also have within that document the 3/5 compromise, which was used to designate the state of the African slave, to say that he or she was human enough to be counted for state representation, but non-human enough to be treated as property that could be mortgaged, insured, publicly traded, and invested. When you think of the number 400 years, then you come to understand why just 52 years of the removal of the legal barriers has not been enough to take away the residue of race that continues to exist within our nation. When you think about this city, Washington, D.C., operated under legal segregation until 1952. You come to understand how entrenched this was at the very seat of the nation's power. Why is this important for us to discuss now? It is important, first of all, because an undealt with past remains present. An undealt with past remains present. An unconfessed and unrepentant history then must be dealt with by the present generation. One of the things that is going to be brought out is this notion of racial indifference. And racial indifference occurs because, one, of an ignorance of history and a feeling that it's not my fault. So I want you to look at your neighbor at your table and say, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And guess what? It's not my fault either. It's none of our faults, because none of us, there was no prenatal cue where you got to choose the race into which you were born. That was conferred upon us by God. And yet we must admit and come to terms that with that conferral by God Himself came certain burdens and certain blessings. And though it's not our fault, it is our problem. So witness to your neighbor again at the table and say, it's not our fault, but it is our problem. And the issue now is, if we acknowledge that, then what is our role as institutional leaders? If we understand, as is going to be borne out, that the church, both in its silence and in its statements, was complicit, and that these churches then built schools whose practices, policies, and even instruction informed the continuation or the challenging of racism, then it is important for us to come to terms with our own histories and to raise them up before our students.
It gives us a further appreciation of the students who come to our campuses, to realize that their very presence is a sign of survival and resilience. And if it is true, if our demographics are true, then it says to us that our future sustainability and viability will be dependent upon our ability to recruit, retain, and encourage students of color. And so I am thankful for this opportunity. I'm so honored to have with us the individuals who are before us. You have their bios in your booklet. And so to save time, because I want them to speak into this, and then after they have spoken into this, then we will have questions and dialogue. First to come before us will be Dr. Bernard Powers, the director of the Center for the Study of Slavery at the College of Charleston. He will be then followed by Jemar Tisby, executive director of the Witness Foundation. He will be followed by Ambassador Michael Battle, former ambassador to the African Union, and then cleanup will be Dr. David Goatley, director of the Office of Black Church Studies at Duke University.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. And Bishop Alexander, thank you so much for organizing this panel. I am deeply honored to be in all of you all's present, and it's been a wonderful meeting so far, and look forward to additional things to come. Now, let me, since I'm a historian, let me just talk a little bit about the past in general and what some people have said about the past. And, you know, I love what William Faulkner says about the past. You know, the past is not dead, it's not even over. And that's particularly the case in the South, but not only the South. And then Claudia Rankin, the Jamaican-born poet, says that you cannot put the past behind you. It's buried in you. Indeed, it has made your very flesh its cupboard. So those are some compelling ways that I think we have to think about the past and its relationship to us right now in 2020. Let me give you another example of something, personal example. And I share this with my students in modern African American history. Now, probably most of you all know about Ida B. Wells, the famous black journalist of the late 19th century, an anti-lynching activist and an advocate for women's rights, born into slavery in Mississippi. Now, in 1968, I was preparing to take the SAT exams to go to college, and her daughter was my tutor, the daughter of an enslaved woman. And then my students look at me and they really wonder, well, like, how old are you? How old are you? But that's how close slavery is to us today in 2020. Now, Americans have never really faced up to this main feature of our history and its implications. And I want to just take a few minutes to just talk about that. Remember these things. When this, actually before the country, when we were colonied, each one of the colonies had slavery, every one of them. And you know, we have this image of the fugitive slave running north, you know, from the south to the north. Well, there was no reason to run north to Massachusetts from Georgia because slavery existed there before the American Revolution. So even when we think about certain aspects of slavery, we're not thinking historically accurately. Some years ago, in the early 2000s, and some of you all might have seen this, there was an exhibit in New York City put on by the New York Historical Society, and the focus was slavery in New York City. It was very well attended, and people were shocked. They said, "What? Slavery in New York City? Are you kidding me? There were slaves here?" Yes. And at one point in the 18th century, there were more enslaved people in New York City than in Charleston. If you can imagine that, but they had no idea. And then on the eve of the American Civil War, the monetized value, I mean, it's even hard to say that because we're talking about people, but the monetized value of enslaved people exceeded the value of all the railroads and the banks and the factories in this country combined. That's an amazing and simultaneously disheartening figure. And as we all know, Bishop Alexander mentioned this, when the Constitution is formed, there were tremendous debates over slavery and how the issue of slavery would be dealt with. One of the things that does come out of that Constitutional Convention is that the Atlantic slave trade to the U.S. could not be interfered with for at least 20 years, which guaranteed that it would exist from 1787 through 1807. And then the federal government would, through Congress, pass legislation that would end it in 1808. And when that commerce in human beings ended to the United States, it ended in one place in 1808, Charleston, South Carolina, where I work today. And I'm pleased and happy to announce that we're building a museum right at one of the main sites where African people entered the North American mainland in Charleston. We're calling it the International African American Museum. And we're going to be opening that at the end of 2021. So look forward to some of you all coming to, well, actually all of you all coming to visit us there in Charleston. I'm here because at the College of Charleston, we started about a year and a half ago something called the Center for the Study of Slavery in Charleston. And we're part of the Universities Studying Slavery Consortium. Over 50 colleges, mainly in the U.S., but some abroad, looking at their respective histories with slavery. And of course, we're just beginning to examine this theme now because there have been so many other aspects of the institution to study. And of course, when we think of slavery, we don't think of mental production, we think of material production, cotton and sugar and so on and so forth. But we have, as a consortium, we have begun to discover some absolutely amazing things. And our center at the College of Charleston is only a year and a half old. A number of these enterprises have longer histories. But let me just recount a few things. So we know that at least one slave auction literally occurred on the campus of Princeton University, right on the campus. And before the American Civil War, about 40% of the students at Princeton University came from the slaveholding South. You all are familiar with what happened at Georgetown University, the sale of 272 enslaved people at the end of the 1830s, in order to raise the money to ensure that that school would remain solvent, financially solvent. And many of those people, they were not just sold from one place to another place, but many of those people were sold to Louisiana from the Upper South. And that was the equivalent of being sold to the Caribbean, into cane fields, where their lives were going to be shortened by that change in geography. And of course, we know even at the College of Charleston that the sale of enslaved people was used to help to raise the endowment, scholarships, and raise other operating funds for our institution. Now, just a few more points. most people in the U.S. do not understand the dual function of the system of slavery. And what we know is that slavery, of course, coerced people to work. But in the United States, as a race-based institution, and for most of the history of slavery internationally, it was not based on race. It was not based on race. But, you know, people historically were, you know, one group conquered another group and enslaved them. But in the U.S. and other places in the Western Hemisphere, in the modern era, is based on race. And so the second function of the system of slavery in the U.S. is to regulate race relations. And that's why when emancipation happens, shortly thereafter, the system of legally enforced, racially established segregation is created. In other words, to continue to provide that function of regulating race relations. And that's what the civil rights movement grows out of, when you think about it. A legacy of slavery, a legacy of Jim Crow, and a legacy of political exclusion. And so when Dr. King gives a famous speech in 1963, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he says that 100 years earlier, America had given black people a check, but when the people went to cash it, the bank said, insufficient funds. Insufficient funds. And so so the civil rights movement, we have to think about that as one legacy of the institution of slavery. Secondly, these ongoing debates and conflicts over Confederate monuments and the naming of buildings after Confederates and other people who were deeply invested in the system of racial segregation, that's another vestige of the institution of slavery, another aspect of the legacy of slavery. And you all know how disruptive and even violent those conflicts can be. Witness Charlottesville and spilling over onto the campus of UVA. So let me conclude this now by saying that there are lessons in all of these things that I've been mentioning to you, lessons for us in the present. And what it means is we need to look at our own campuses and our histories, our present as well as our past. For example, we want to examine, well, what is the climate of race on our campus? Because in significant ways, that climate, whether we recognize it or not, has been shaped by the legacy of slavery. Now, remember this too. The schools that were established in the late 19th century or early 20th century are not off of the hook either. See? Because it could very well be that some of the funds that were used to establish them really have antebellum roots. It could be that some of the buildings that were constructed on those campuses were constructed by convict labor. See? The convict leasing system, which many people describe as slavery by another name. And it could be that some of the buildings are named after people who were deeply invested in the system of segregation. Now, this is a past that cannot merely be studied. Cannot merely be studied, but the legacy of slavery demands repair. It demands repair in the present. And that is because virtually every racial disparity that exists in the country today, in one way or other, has its roots deeply planted in the system of slavery. And so on our campuses, we need to talk about these things, we need to teach about these things, and we need to consider the ways in which repair can be effected. Two final points are these. You know, and these 2 points have everything to do with religion and faith and the working of God in people's lives. First of all, when you think about it, it was religion, it was faith, it was hope, the story of the deliverance of the Israelites that enabled enslaved people to survive. And so when the first shots of the Civil War are fired, these people heard the voice of God in those cannons. They heard the voice of deliverance in those cannons. But the other way that religion plays a role here is, let's take the life, the biography of John Newton as an example. A man deeply invested in the Atlantic slave trade, a ship captain of a slave trading vessel, had his heart and conscience pricked by God. Ultimately, then changes the character in the course of his life, becomes an Anglican minister, and eventually joins the abolitionist movement. And so that's a story of deliverance and redemption, and it says that there is no person beyond the redemption of God. And these stories that are deeply embedded in the institution of slavery and its consequences, we can use those to talk about the effects of God in people's lives at the same time that we think about what course of action we're going to take to effect repair in society today. Thank you very much.
As Jemar gets ready to address us, one interesting point of history, and Leith Anderson sort of tipped it when he talked about the GI Bill and those soldiers who came back. Point of fact, that was true for everyone except soldiers of color. Soldiers of color who came back from World War II were denied those benefits. So when you think about the single most important piece of legislation for the development of the middle class being denied people of color, then that is an important dot in the line when we talk about generational wealth and generational transfer of wealth.
Well, first of all, I did not select this seat in the middle. I waited my turn, and then this was the only seat that was left. I think Dr. Powers with his bow tie should be right here, front and center. And secondly, I think the only reason I'm among such distinguished personnel on this platform is probably because I wrote a book called The Color of Compromise, with the subtitle, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. So that's fun reading for you. In the book, I begin with the tragic story of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. The death of 4 precious young black girls as they were getting ready for the Youth Day Sunday service. It was an act of racial terrorism designed to instill fear and intimidation in the black community during the Civil Rights Movement, and we need to name it as such. But I also talk about what happened the day after that. A young white lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr. had been scheduled to give a talk in front of the all-white Young Men's Business Association of the city. And he went on with his talk as scheduled, but he changed the content. And he challenged his listeners, and he asked them a question. He said, who threw that bomb? Was it a Negro or a white? And he said, the answer should be all of us. All of us who did it, all of us who said the N-word, whose crude jokes rocked the party with laughter. And he also turned his attention to the church. He said, how many of us visited the Negroes in their hour of travail? He even went so far as to say how many of us allowed Negroes into the ranks of our churches. And what Charles Morgan Jr. was articulating, I think, was the concept of complicity. So numerically speaking, the people who actually plan and plot racial terrorism and put the dynamite at the church is a very small number of people. But the fact was that there was a neighborhood in Birmingham that already had the nickname Dynamite Hill, that the city already had the nickname Bombingham. And the idea is that the most egregious acts of racial terrorism, like a church bombing, can only occur within a context of compromise. And so the book is about the way the American church, and to be specific, the white American church, was compromised and was complicit with the growth of a racial hierarchy in the nation. And what we have to come to grips with is that it wasn't the vast majority of white Christians who were physically doing the acts of violence, let's say, but it was the lack of action and the lack of pushing back and the lack of challenging status quo and the act of compromising instead of confronting racism that created what we have today. And so the idea for us today is that, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. Or like what Elie Wiesel said, and I'm paraphrasing, that silence supports the oppressor, not the oppressed. And so in the 21st century, as we are living in the legacy of slavery and segregation and racialization, how will Christians today, including Christian colleges and universities, confront racism instead of compromising and being complicit with it? I have the privilege of going to many colleges and universities that are part of this council. And one of the points I make is that we need to reckon with at least three concepts, three ideas that are inherent in compromise and racism in this country. Number one, we got to reckon with money. That fundamentally, race-based chattel slavery was an economically exploitative system that profited off of the backs and the labor and the bodies of black people. Why? In order to increase the bottom line of plantation owners and all those associated with the industry. Now, racism and racial hatred are certainly part of that. But if we neglect to talk about the financial aspect, we'll never actually make progress in closing things like the racial wealth gap, which have vast implications for other things like education and healthcare, life expectancy, infant mortality, all of these things. The second thing we need to reckon with is white supremacy. Now, I know that's a trigger word for a lot of people, and maybe you in this room, you hear that term and you think, oh, identity politics, Marxist, communist, whatever the label or the epithet you want to put on it. But think of it this way, as my friend Daniel Hill says in his book, White Awake, white supremacy is the narrative of racial difference. It's the story we tell ourselves about race. And if we don't reckon with this as an ideology, then we'll never actually change the fundamental story that we tell about race, and racism is going to keep cropping up in different manifestations. First, we had slavery, much more overt and physical and visible, but then we had Jim Crow segregation. Now a racialized society like Emerson and Smith talk about in their book, Divided by Faith. And what's consistent among all these manifestations of racism is that ideology, that narrative of race. And we got to change that narrative. As Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, said, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. In other words, there's a consistency and even a resurgence from time to time of this narrative of racial difference. And we got to address that in our curricula and in our training of professors and faculty members and even alumni and trustee. That's why all the theology I learned in seminary was theology until it was black theology or Latin American theology. The otherizing and the marginalization of the theological and intellectual contributions of people of color is something that we have to come to grips with in our institutions. And lastly, we have to come to grips with the fact that racism is violent, that it's bloody, that at the end of the day, in order to enforce a system of white supremacy based on greed and money, when what I think was the thumbprint of God on people, the image of God talked about in Genesis 1:26 and 27, when that begins to rise up and people push back against their own oppression, it has to be stamped down, often through violence. And so there's very real fears of people of color, particularly black people, when we hear this rhetoric, whether coming from politicians or Christian leaders, we know what it ends up with down the road. And so this is not sort of a theoretical, abstract, arm's length issue for most people of color. It's an existential thing. Are we safe? And that begins with some of the emotional and spiritual safety, but it also includes physical safety as well. So Christian colleges and universities, you have a tremendous opportunity, but also a tremendous responsibility to address these issues in that critical stage of a life and a season where people are learning and absorbing and figuring out what they think about the world and how they're going to make an impact. And if we, in the 21st century, are complicit and we compromise, then 50 years from now, should the Lord tarry, we will ask, where was the church? Thank you.
I want to give context for my discussion out of my own background, both as a diplomat and as a theologian. In 2012, I was speaking at the All Africa Conference of Churches in Nairobi, Kenya. And while I was talking about American foreign policy, one of the persons in the audience stood up angrily, a young man from Ghana, and raised the question, why has the United States not been more actively and aggressively apologetic about the institution of slavery? And I recounted for him the number of times that U.S. leaders had, in fact, apologized for slavery. While never sufficient is any apology, the apology was made. And then I used that as an opportunity to raise consciousness among the delegates of that conference who had come from all over the continent of Africa. And I said to the young man who raised the question that slavery has dual responsibility. It has responsibility from the West, participating in vicious, inhumane, ungodly, downright sinful selling of human beings. And it also had responsibility with complicity on the African continent. And I said to that audience that one of the things that we now have that we did not have during slavery is that most of us as African Americans were not until recently able to identify where we and our ancestors actually came from. Fortunately for me, the DNA of my family tree had already been established. And I knew that my family was from Ghana and the Ivory Coast. So I said to the young man from Ghana, I said, you know, had my ancestors not been defeated in a tribal conflict and not sold to the West, I might have been the Ghanaian ambassador and not the U.S. ambassador. And so what happened as a result of that was that the All-African Council of Churches committed that they would start intentionally dealing with Africa's history in slavery. And I was extremely glad for that. The following year, I was in Bahir Dar, Ethiopia, at the African Union Peace and Security Council meeting. And we were dealing with the current slavery that still exists on the African continent. And I raised the question along with some others about the slave trade that now goes from Eritrea and Ethiopia to Sudan and Egypt. The president of Sudan was in the meeting. The foreign minister of Ethiopia, the prime minister of Ethiopia was in the meeting. The foreign minister of Egypt was in the meeting. In fact, African heads of state were in the meeting. Hosting that particular conference was the former president of Nigeria. And I said to him and to others that I challenged the African continent to rid itself of the modern day slave trade that exists on the continent. They committed to do so. So in 2014, the Peace and Security Council meeting in Bahir Dar dealt with this whole question of slavery. Now that's interesting history. It's also helpful and hopeful as we deal with the questions of reconciliation, because reconciliation is always a two-way street. It is never a one-way street. Reconciliation never happens on a one-way street. It is always a two-way street. After leaving diplomatic service, I went to Cincinnati as the executive vice president and provost of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, which is the only museum in this country that consciously deals with the history of U.S. slavery and simultaneously, not in a secondary way, but in a simultaneous primary way, deals with the question of modern-day slavery. And shockingly, there are more people in slavery today on planet Earth than were in slavery in the transatlantic slave trade. Every single continent on planet Earth engages in some form of slavery. Not the same kind of slavery based on race, but slavery based on economic inequalities, women being trafficked in sex trade, people who are hired and never paid, brought from foreign countries and forced into servitude, paying off debt. Slavery is real, slavery is alive. The white church and the black church have dealt with the issue separately and in an interesting, distinct way. So we brought together at the Freedom Center leaders of the evangelical community and leaders of the African American church community in a freedom summit and raised the question, why is it that many white churches are very comfortable dealing with modern-day slavery, but totally uncomfortable dealing with America's legacy of slavery? And why is it that the black church is extremely comfortable dealing with the legacy of American slavery, but unfortunately silent on the question of modern-day slavery? So the intent was to say that in both instances, the root of a movement based upon seeking justice and equality is there, but the approach focuses on modern-day slavery, while white evangelicals acknowledge the legitimacy of black church engagement in the civil rights movement and dealing with the legacy of American slavery, and each saying amen to the other, but at the same time, each saying you only are dealing with part of the issue. So until we deal with the whole question of slavery, we will never reach transformation or reconciliation. And then last year, Bishop Alexander called me, and I was very happy that he did, to work on the initial phases of planning the R400 celebration or remembrance and commemoration of slavery in this country. And I was very happy to have some of my former staff in Ethiopia to work with him when he visited the African Union, at which time the president of Kenya made a commitment that all of the heads of state in the African Union, 54 heads of state, would start focusing as best they could on the question of Africa's role in slavery. Now the challenge to you. Every major theological movement that has sought to accent human justice has been based on the notion of transformation and reconciliation. Believing that God calls transformed and reconciled people to be actively engaged in the process of transforming and reconciling the world unto the message of transformation and reconciliation. There are 5 existential principles in such a theology. One is the issue of freedom. The other, the principle of love. The principle of justice. The principle that deals with courage. And we have to also recognize simultaneously that we will never be able to bring those principles together unless we can talk about the existential principle of forgiveness. Just definitions for a brief moment. Forgiveness does not excuse wrong. It never has and it never will. Forgiveness is designed to bring people to a consciousness of reconciliation and hopefully transformation that leads to redemption. It does no good for someone to say, I forgive you, or I am forgiven, if I never move beyond the moment of forgiveness to being transformed and changed, redeemed and reconciled with whatever it was that I needed to have been forgiven for, or whatever it was that I demanded forgiveness for. Forgiveness is not passive, it is exceedingly active. Love is the power and the only power that can confront racism, the history of racism. It is the only power that can confront anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It is the only power that can confront and demolish oppression. Unfortunately, we have a tendency to bifurcate the notion of love. We think it's okay simply to love our neighbor if we define neighbor only as people who look like, walk like, talk like, worship like, and pray like us. But love means we reach across all kinds of aisles and intentionally reach the people who are not exactly like us. Justice makes the playing field even. Justice brings about the mandate that we try to erase the inequities. Interesting thing about this whole economic base for slavery. Andrew Young stated at that Freedom Summit at the Freedom Center that the only way to deal with and change modern day slavery is if we take away the economic benefits from slavery. Well, that's exactly what happened with the American slave institution. People think that people just got together and decided out of the kindness of their hearts it's time now to end slavery. Oh, no. Slavery had become less economically productive and had become divisive in this nation. And so there were people who were willing to raise the question about trying to end slavery, not because they were kind-hearted people, but because there was no longer an economic benefit. And the strange thing is that the economic inequities that we now experience in our society now, part of it had to do with the notion that those who gave up economic benefit from slavery have to be repaid. So then you had a Jim Crow system where my great-grandparents were slaves. My grandparents were sharecroppers, working for little to nothing, still doing the work that my grandparents had done, but under the delusion that they were being paid, but they really were not being paid a sufficient wage. And then when African Americans actually developed an economic base, as in Oklahoma, then you had this whole notion of white people being empowered to go and destroy whole communities of African American middle-class people. In 1906, in the city of Atlanta, there was a race ride. And you know how upset we get when we talk about race rides? But that's normally when black folk ride. In 1906, white people went into black shops and businesses, drugged black people out of their homes, murdered them in the street, and walked away, and nobody was prosecuted. The rationale was that black people in Atlanta had gotten too uppity, owned too many businesses, had too much money, and white folk had to put them in their place because they had gotten so uppity. The legacy of racism is putting folk in their place and preventing them from getting, quote, so uppity. Interestingly enough, that was one of the same stupid comments made about President Obama, that he was an uppity person, had gotten beyond where he should have been. How dare anybody think that they can judge the limits of anybody else? Freedom, just a moment about freedom.
I need to get Dr. Goatley.
Okay, get it up. Okay, get it up. Then we'll let Dr. go, so I can go for a while. Thank you.
I got to get Dr. Goatley.
I want to say amen to the ambassador's sermon. And if you had just a few more minutes, we could have had a call for decision. I want to join my colleagues on this panel in expressing appreciation for being included. And also want to commend this President's Council for your both intellectual and moral leadership in addressing issues this week, like slavery and abuse. That demonstrates quite a bit of leadership and courage, and we hope that it will be contagious with your fellow colleagues in administration and higher education. Just a commercial, on Thursdays I wear black as a part of a World Council of Churches global campaign called Thursdays in Black toward a world without sexual violence and without rape. And would like to encourage you to consider whether campaigns like that might find place in your college environments. Those of us who are Christians have a call to truth. And Christian colleges and universities, as a part of your responsibility, you have a vocation to pursue truth. The way the truth is handled, however, in many contemporary places all around the world, is very selectively. And you never can get at truth if you only listen to the voices of privilege. So we have to ask ourselves what voices are not at the table. And when we talk about issues of truth, people without privilege are often not included at the table of conversation and dissemination and testimony. And so when that's a part of the calling, and I hope that a part of your conversation and imagination will be about responding to and engaging in the truth about race. We all know it's a social construction, but we also know that it's real and its ramifications continue. And so part of the question is, how do you leverage your institutional power to deal with issues of race and the legacy of slavery? There's much that's been said, and so I've had to edit my contributions to try to avoid being redundant. So I'll do the best that I can. Part of the truth of slavery is slavery was brutal, not inconvenient, not sad, but was brutal. It was brutal to be physically branded with hot iron. It was brutal to have your body mutilated. It was brutal to be whipped and beaten with leather and then had salt poured in the wound. It was physically brutal. Slavery was sexually brutal. Women, but not only women, also men and children, but primarily women, were raped at will by slave owners and the slavocracy. And not only did men do that, there are documented testimonies of slave owners having their adolescent boys and taking them to slave quarters and showing them how to rape a woman. Slavery was brutal, and that's a part of the truth that we should confront. Slavery was brutal in terms of selling family members apart from each other. If you have a child, can you imagine someone taking your child, selling your child to someone else, and you would never see them again? Slavery was brutal, and we need to acknowledge it, and to, while we can't draw direct lines, appreciate the kind of ongoing trauma that does in terms of people's life stories and consciousness. But it traumatizes those who are victims, and it traumatizes those who are perpetrators, because for them, they were taught that it's all right for you to brutalize another person. And whether explicitly or implicitly, that permission continues to go, because black lives are not valued in this country the same as white lives are. It can be documented in terms of any study you want to do. It's clear that black people are treated with less value, less respect, and less honor because of the implicit and explicit lessons that race does matter in ways that make some people in a hierarchy more valued than others, and others less valued. And if you value people less as bodily, you will also value them less in terms of their emotion and their intellect. And that is a part of the legacy of the American experience, and that is truth. And as people who are in higher education, we are called to deal with truth of both the brutality and of the benefits accrued to some. There are unearned benefits in the United States that are accrued to people because they're white. And that's a part of the benefit, that's a part of the legacy of slavery. We've already heard about the economic benefit. Let me give you just two examples. In the low country of South Carolina, that was swampland. And the colonial residents couldn't do anything with swampland. But West Africans who were brought as slaves had been growing rice since the second millennial before the Common Era. That's a long time. And they had cultivated systems of irrigation where they could irrigate through rainwater, they could irrigate through using clay that retained moisture, and they could irrigate through tidal waves. So they were experts in growing rice and brought both the physical capital and the intellectual capital and helped turn South Carolina into an agricultural powerhouse. That continues to benefit today. Another example, all of us in here, likely most of us, have benefited from inoculations. And so if you read the typical stories about that, you read about Cotton Mather and Boston and his physician, and that's what comes up in the privileged story of inoculations. What does not come up is that the Boston Second Church gave, churches participating in Massachusetts in slavery, gave a slave called Onesimus to Cotton Mather, who was from a West African village, who they practiced making a small incision in the skin, inserting smallpox in it, covering it up. People would get a little sick for 1 week, get over it, and never have smallpox again. That's where Cotton Mather learned about inoculation. And that's why most of us in here have not been affected by some illnesses that could have taken us out. Millions of people in the country, and it's because of the benefit of someone who was enslaved. Those stories happen over and over, and you are called to pursue truth in its brutality and its benefit. And so, as was said earlier, you sitting here, you may not be, you are not culpable for slavery, but you are responsible. And all of our ethicists in here will recognize that. You're not culpable, but you are responsible. So part of the question is, how do you utilize and leverage your power in your institution and the power that your institution has in its denominational life, in its Christian network, in its locality, in its state, and with other peers? How do you exercise your power to influence what was said earlier, the need to repair? What is appropriate action for addressing today and redress the lingering effects of slavery? You may not be culpable, but because you have power and because you're called to truth, you are responsible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your amazing remarks, deep critical thoughts, and a call to action. So at this time, we're going to open it up for Q&A, question and answers, and potentially you may be intimidated to ask questions. But let me say this right now. This is a safe space, or you could call it a brave space. And this is where we as a family, we as the body of Christ, of believers, servants of the Most High God, get to come together and ask important questions. Because I don't believe you can be a leader today if you are not wrestling with the idea of what does cultural competence require of me, balanced with cultural humility. And what has God called me to do? As He has given me a level of power, how is He asking me to empower others? So let me start with the first question, which is maybe a double question. What can campus leaders do today to create a milieu in which it is hospitable to the diverse students who are crossing our campuses? So before you answer that, let me just put on the record. So I am Dr. Kim Battle Walters Deneau. I am a first-generation college student who went to college. I went to a CCCU school, for which I'm forever grateful. Vanguard set the standard for me, created an environment to allow me to flourish as a leader. But then I also went to state schools. So I'm gonna give you two examples, both at state and secular, state and Christian, that happened. One, I was at first week in my PhD program, and one of the professors saw me. I was the only African-American student at this Research One school in this particular program. And he said to me, I said my name to this particular professor, and he looked at me looked me up and down, and he said, "People like you don't make it here." That was my welcome to my doctoral program. As a first-generation student who didn't have many models to go by, I was just glad to be there. That was my welcome. Another example at a Christian environment where the missions teams decided that they would create auction block in the cafeteria, and they would have people demonstrate as if they were in chains as slaves to raise money for the mission teams. And I was a student witnessing this, and I was aghast. I could not believe it. It'd be like a rape survivor watching a mockery of a rape take place. I was just horrified. When I went to tell the administrators, the response was, "Oh, Kim, you're just being overly sensitive. This is to raise funding for missions." What can Christian leaders do from your perspective? Because we should be different. What can Christian leaders do to create an environment on campuses that are safe for students of color to come to? We want them to come to our campuses. We want their tuition dollars. But how do we create an environment that allows them to thrive?
I'll mention a couple of things because I'm often on college and university campuses that are Christian. The first thing is listen to the students, particularly students of color, and I will say this as a bonus because I appreciate you. Do not be afraid of focusing on black students. So we say students of color, that is a big category, and every ethnic group has its own story, which is important and worthy of attention. But I do fear that as we start talking broadly about people of color, students of color, that we are not focusing on that a fundamental aspect of not only a racial and ethnic story, but our national story as well, specifically connected to race-based chattel slavery. You understand what I'm saying? That doesn't mean ignore other people of color, other ethnicities. It just means that if you need to focus on one group for a particular thing, that's okay. And start by listening to students, because their stories of on-the-ground interactions with teachers, with staff, and with students will reveal a very different character and identity of your institution than sometimes you're aware of. And so that might be a listening tour, inviting students to come speak to you, or it might be something that's less intimidating because if you're an executive level leader, they may not feel open to talking to you, and so there could be some people that on your staff that you have do that, or maybe there's a written campaign, but listen to the students. The second thing is, whenever possible, hire faculty and staff of color, more than one at a time. So a lot of times we'll look at the student demographics in terms of race and ethnicity, and that might be climbing, and that's a good sign, but we're not looking as closely at faculty and staff who have a really big impact on students. And so then you want to bring in a person of color onto your staff, but if it's just that one person in the department or on the committee or what, that is immense pressure on that single person. Burnout is a very distinct possibility. So don't just hire one at a time. 2 and 3 and 4, they call them cluster hires in the business, I think. And so think about that. And then lastly, as hard as it is to stay fiscally afloat these days, if you want to make true progress on racial justice, you're going to have to get used to losing some money. There will be alumni and donors who dislike your bold stances on race. But as we spoke about before, the idea of racialization has always been connected to a financial aspect, no less so now than it was then. And if you think there's a way to make significant progress on race without losing money, you're in for a rude awakening. And There's a quote by a historian that said, all the Christian conviction in the world couldn't dent the purse of one slaveholder. So I wonder how much Christian conviction in the world would dent the endowments or the donations of Christian universities and institutions, and what you're willing to put on the line for the sake of justice, dignity, and equality. Thank you.
I'd like to add a point to that. Beyond the focus on the campuses, as presidents of colleges and universities, you have the capacity to focus on the larger communities around you. And you would never develop an affinity for people of color and the communities of color unless you're actively and intentionally engaging the communities of color on a regular basis. For example, how many African American, Latino, Asian American churches do you show up at just simply to be present? And how many civic associations and business associations that are minority-based business and civic associations do you just simply show up at? I was president of a historically black theological seminary for about 7 years, the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. I had to consciously show up at white folks' gatherings in order to raise money. So I was very comfortable with that. It would be also good to see white presidents show up in the black community, not to recruit a student, but simply to be there. Because if you build friendship with the community feels more comfortable sending its students to you. So focus on those relationships, and if you do that well, you're not going to have to worry about the rest. People will come because they will know you are a safe environment, and you will then hire faculty in clusters. You will then do other kinds of things, but show up, and if you show up, folk will simply come.
And I'd like to add, Ambassador, in addition to the official role as a administrator, as a president, more and more racially, people don't have friends of another race. Go make yourself some black friends. Rather than, because you can hide behind a role. So you can go and be appropriate and make a role and shake your hands and do that, and then retreat back into your standard cast of characters. But if you don't have black friends who can be honest with you and say to you, you know that thing you just said? I was with somebody and they were offhandedly talking, and unintentionally he used the term something, and lynched something in a sentence. And he needed somebody close enough to him to say, don't say that, because, and he was apologetic, and he said, I didn't know, I didn't even realize. It was so embedded in terms of the places that he goes that his unintended, racially insensitive and injurious language, if he didn't have somebody close enough to him to check him, then he's going to do that all the time. Additionally, I'd like to encourage you to encourage your faculty to include black literature in all of your required classes. There's no excuse in having church history courses with no black authors. That's just, it's just unacceptable. It's unintelligible. Or theology courses with no black authors. And then you get one black student in a room, and then the faculty starts saying to the black student, tell me what I ought to read. It's not that student's job to tell the faculty what to read. You ought to be paying them to do it then. And so, but building in kind of an expectation of what are the voices that we don't listen to. And there are key voices, and there are black authors across disciplines that will enrich the intellectual project of the curriculum. And that will be something that gets faculty more familiar, students more familiar as well.
I'm Paul Maurer, president of Montreat College in North Carolina. I also teach American constitutionalism. And first, I just want to say thank you. Outstanding comments. Really appreciate everything each one of you said. I'd be curious to hear your perspective on the project the New York Times launched last year, the 1619 Project. It's an overt attempt to recast American history around the concept of slavery rather than the founding in 1776. I'd just love to hear your comments about that.
I think that's a very important project because it's going to bring what we've been talking about here in this room to the attention of so many people who otherwise would never engage with the issue. As I mentioned in my remarks, when they had the New York Historical Society put on the exhibit, Slavery in New York, I mean, it opened so many people's eyes to something that was really a fundamental aspect of life in that area historically. You know, and we just don't realize how many aspects of, well, let me rephrase that and let me put it this way. We just don't realize how fundamental the issue of slavery has been to the unfolding of American history. You know, I always think about this example. And as I said, we're going to be opening the International African American Museum in Charleston at the end of 2021. And the reason that we have international in that name is because it is truly unfortunate that when many people think about African American history, they think, well, okay, it is about the South, and it's only about the South. And yeah, it is about the South, but it's about the North also. But it is about international issues too. And I always go to the Haitian Revolution, the only example in world history in which an enslaved people rose up, liberated themselves, and then cast off the colonial authorities too, and established control over their own country. And of course, that's the reason that Thomas Jefferson was then able to purchase Louisiana, which then doubled the size of the United States at that time. And most Americans have no idea of how the onward westward march of this country from sea to shining sea was fundamentally rooted in the access to that real estate, that territory, which was the result of a successful slave insurrection. And that's just one example. That's just one example. And the point is, this is really a crucial theme in American history, and we need to develop a greater appreciation for that. And by the way, when I teach American history and African American history, I teach the Louisiana Purchase in the same way, regardless of the course. So,
can I respond to that question as well? One of the unfortunate things that happen is that we in this country exercise exclusive disjunctions, as if you cannot do a both-and concept. It's important to focus on 1619, but you cannot not focus on what is historically considered the birth of what we now know as this country. You have to do both. What happens is that people don't intentionally include both stories. It's not an exclusive disjunction. It's a both-and proposition.
Another question.
I have a campus in Nashville, Tennessee that's about 40% diverse with we have 150 DACA students. African Americans would probably be the equivalent of would be the largest diversity group that we have. In the current immigration debate in America, how would I empower African Americans to speak and lead out of their story in terms of the cheap labor that occurs in many cases with the factory families that are undocumented immigrants here to the United States. How do I lift the story of slavery to speak into that and empower my African American students on campus to be leaders in the process of that story of immigration? Can you help me know how to tie the pieces together of that?
Well, part of it is understanding the linked histories. So I'll give you an example. When Social Security was rolled out and its benefits were enumerated, two groups of people were kept out of those benefits: domestics and migrant workers. Who were the domestics and who were the migrant workers? They were the people of color, black, brown, Asian. The state Supreme Court ruling that established the precedent that a person of color could not testify against a white person was not in Alabama, it was in California. And it was around an Asian not being able to testify against a white. So it's knowing history helps establish mutual responsibility. That it is as much a calling for me to advocate for the immigrant, for the migrant worker, as it is anything else. Because sadly, the history is we've been treated the same. And so I would offer that as one way of getting at it.
May I also say that I'd encourage you to not feel an obligation to do it alone. There are other institutions of higher education in your state who have faculty members or staff members who have been on this journey as well. And that's an opportunity for collaboration and creating some synergy and building some relationships between your institution and people at another institution. And you don't know in advance what other opportunities and possibilities that will open for collaboration and strengthening as well. So there's some folks who've already been doing it, and there's no reason to try to reinvent the wheel, but to lean in and to work in partnership and collaboration with a sibling institution.
We are out of time, so please join me in thanking our amazing panel.
Thank you so much, Bishop Alexander and distinguished panel. You have informed and strengthened our resolve for the responsibilities we have. Thank you so much. So friends, if you plan to go to the museum this afternoon, the bus will leave from the front of the hotel at 1:45, I believe, 1:45. So if you made RSVP to go, please be at the bus at 1:45. Also, tomorrow morning, breakfast will begin here in this room at 7 a.m. And at 7:30, we'd really invite you to join with small groups together for informal conversations about the roles we have, ways in which those roles impact us as individuals, as families, as married couples. So that will happen here in this